All right, everyone. My name is Brent Bishel. I'm the preacher at the Church of Christ in Springville, California. And I want to bring a lesson to you that I've entitled A Norm Fields Bible Q&A Malfunction number 2. So on Bible Q&A on July 30th, 2018, Norm Fields, who's a preacher in LaGrange, Georgia, Church of Christ at the North Side congregation, he gave a lesson on realized eschatology, and at timestamp 6:30 through 7:04, Norm reads from 2 Peter 3:10, and it says there that the day of the Lord will come as a thief in the night, in which the heavens will pass away with a great noise, and the elements will melt with fervent heat. Both the earth and the works that are in it will be burned up. Now, Norm says this about the word elements. He says, quote, "If you study that word, elements, in the original language, it basically is subatomic. You know, you go down to the subatomic level of matter, and it even includes that. Anything that comprises matter," he says, "will be burned up." So as we look at this word, the Strong's number for the word is G for Greek, 4747. And here it is. It's the word stoichion. And it means something orderly in arrangement, a serial or a basal, fundamental, initial element, principle, or rudiment. That is, the ABCs or the 1, 2, 3s of something. And it's used 7 times in the King James Version of the Bible. So here it is, the first time it's used in the Bible. And notice Paul says in Galatians 4:3, "Even so we, when we were children, were in bondage under the stoichion." There it is, the elements of the world. That's the elements of the Jewish world. And the bondage that they were under was not the subatomic particles of matter, but it was in reference to the Jewish law. But notice what Norm says here. Now, if you study that word elements in the original language, it basically is subatomic. And you know, you go down to the subatomic level of matter, and it even includes that. Anything that comprises matter, he says, will be burned up. That's Norm Fields' exact quote as to the definition of the word stoichion. But when we look in this context, Norm, regarding the elements of Judaism, we find that Paul uses the word stoichion. So when they were under Judaism, they were under bondage to the elements or the rudiments or the basic principles of Judaism. Now, Norm, this has nothing to do with the elements of the periodic table of elements or subatomic particles. Nothing whatsoever. That's just a made-up, ignorant definition of the word. The second time the word is used, it's found in Galatians 4:9. And Paul says, "But now after that ye have known God, or rather are known of God. How turn ye again to the weak and the beggarly," notice, stoichion, the elements. There's your Strong's number, 4747, "whereunto ye desire again to be in bondage." Now, this is the bondage of the elements of Judaism. Now, notice, here is the qualification for the word elements. Ye observe days and months and times and years. So here's the Sabbath days. The months are the new moons. The times are the Pentecost and Feast of Weeks, a Feast of Tabernacles, all of that, and the years are the years of Jubilee. So there is your definition by Paul, but notice what Norm Fields says. He quotes, "Now, if you study the word elements in the original language, it basically is subatomic. You know, you go down to the subatomic level of matter, and it even includes that. Anything that comprises matter," he says, "will be burned up." That's from Norm Fields. Norm, there are no subatomic particles here, just Jewish law. It was the elements of Judaism that were in view here. Now, the next time the word is used in our New Testament is Colossians 2:8. And notice he says, "Beware lest any man spoil you through philosophy and vain deceit, after the tradition of men, after the rudiments," there it is, the basic principles, the stoichion, the elements of the world. That is the Jewish world, Norm, and not after Christ. But Norm says, if you study the word elements in the original language, it basically is subatomic. You know, you go down to the subatomic level of matter, And it even includes that. Anything that comprises matter, he says, will be burnt up. Well, does Paul here mean subatomic particles, Norm? In this text, the terms, quote, the traditions of men, and, quote, the rudiments of the world, are parallel. They refer to, or they mean the same thing. Surely the traditions of men do not refer, Norm, to subatomic particles. The traditions of men refer to Second Temple Judaism, and you'll find that to be so if you look at Galatians 1:14, Colossians 2:8, and 1 Peter 1 and verse 18. Now you go and study that. The next time the word is used is in Colossians 2:20, where Paul says, wherefore, if ye be dead with Christ, that is through their baptism, they died with Christ, from the stoichion of the world. That's the rudiments, the elements of the Jewish world. Why? As though living in the Jewish world. That's what he means there. Are you subject to ordinances? It's the ordinances of Judaism. Now watch. Here's the elements. Touch not. Taste not. Handle not. The Norm, these are all the elements of the Jewish world. These are the rudiments of the Jewish law. But Norm says, look at this, folks. Now, if you study that word, elements in the original language, it basically is subatomic. You know, it goes down to the subatomic level of matter, and it even includes that. Anything that comprises matter, he says, will be burned up. Once again, there's no subatomic particles here, Norm. They died to the elements of Judaism when they were baptized into Christ, and thus they were no longer in bondage to the elements of the Jewish world for their salvation. The elements of this text here, do not touch, do not taste, do not handle. These were all the elements of the rudiments of the Jewish law. Had nothing to do with subatomic particles, as you say, falsely say. The fifth time this word is used is in Hebrews 5:12. And the writer says, for though by this time you ought to be teachers, you need someone to teach you again the first principles. There it is, the Greek Strong's number 4747, stoichion. The basic principles, the first principles, the rudiments of the oracles of God, and you have come to need milk and not solid food. Well, look at Norm's definition one more time. Norm said, quote, now if you study that word, elements, in the original language, it basically is subatomic. You know, you go down to the subatomic level of matter. And it even includes that. Anything that comprises matter, he says, will be burned up. That is a direct quote from Norm Fields on this word. And he never looked this word up, by the way. So I would ask Norm, where is the idea of subatomic particles being connected to this word as it's used in the New Testament by the inspired writers of the New Testament? We haven't seen your definition found in Scripture yet, sir. So the first principles of the oracles of God is Judaism. It's the Old Covenant law. Was it not the law, Norm, that led them to faith in Christ? Yes or no? Now, folks, look at this. Galatians 3:23, but before faith came, we, the Jews, were kept under guard by the law, kept for the faith, which would afterward be revealed. Look at Galatians 3:24. Therefore, the law was our tutor. That's a Jewish hour, not a Gentile hour. It was our tutor to bring us, that's the Jew, to Christ, that we might, be justified by faith. There you have it. Now look at what Jesus said regarding the law. In John 5:46, for if you believe Moses, he's speaking to the Jews, you would believe me, for he wrote about me. Here is the elements of the Jewish law containing statements regarding the oracles of God and of the Messiah. So in John 5:47, but if you do not believe his writings, how will you believe my words? That nails it down right there. So the Jews needed to learn the first principles, or the stoichion, of the oracles of God. And the stoichion were the first principles, the rudiments of the law that would bring them to faith in Christ. So stoichion has nothing to do, Norm, with subatomic particles. You cannot find that in the New Testament. You cannot prove that. You're wrong on this. Thus, so far, we have seen that the biblical writers use the word stoichion, and it was always up to this point used as an apostolic buzzword for the elements of Judaism. So this word's inspirational use, as it's used by inspiration by the writers of the New Testament, was always a term that referred to Judaism and the elements of the Old Covenant or the Jewish world. So we come back around to 2 Peter 3:10, of which Norm ignores this entire context, by the way, and I'll set the context and show you. But there it says, but the day of the Lord will come as a thief in the night, in which the heavens will pass away with a great noise, and the elements, there's that word stoichion. Here's the 6th time it's used in the New Testament. So the elements will melt with fervent heat, and both the earth and the works that are in it will be burned up. Up until this point, it has never been used by the apostles to refer to the subatomic particles of the elements. And it's not used here in this way either. So 2 Peter 3:11, therefore, since all these things will be dissolved, and actually in the Greek, this is in the present tense, are being dissolved. At the time Peter wrote it, those things were being dissolved. What manner of persons ought you to be in holy conduct and godliness? Now notice this, looking for and hastening the coming of the day of God, because of which the heavens will be dissolved, being on fire, and the elements, the stoichion, will melt with fervent heat. Well, Peter says, nevertheless, we, according to his promise, and we're going to see later that this promise comes out of Isaiah 65 and 66. They were looking for a new heavens and a new earth in which righteousness dwells. So Peter gets his new heaven and new earth motif, Norm, out of the Old Testament prophets. If you'll go back and get the context, which you failed to do, 2 Peter 3:1 and 2, it says, beloved, now I write to you this second epistle, in both of which to stir up your pure minds by way of reminder. Now, what was he reminding them in his epistles? That you may be mindful of the words which were spoken before by the holy prophets. That's what he was reminding them of in both of his epistles. So Peter's eschatology is nothing more than the eschatology of the Old Testament prophets. And notice, the day of the Lord in the Old Testament was never a day in which God destroyed the globe, but a day in which God judged the land. Look at this. Norm, it would do you good to pay attention here. Isaiah 13:6, this is against Babylon. Wail, for the day of the Lord, here's judgment, is at hand. It will come as destruction from the Almighty. This is not a judgment of the globe. The day of the Lord was never a judgment of the globe, and neither is it a judgment of the globe in the New Testament in 2 Peter 3. It's a judgment of the land, or the nations that were in the land that the Bible is dealing with. Amos 5:18, woe you who desire the day of the Lord. For what good is the day of the Lord to you? It will be darkness and not light. Notice that. So in the day of the Lord, the judgment comes and it gets dark. Notice Amos 5:20, is not the day of the Lord darkness and not light? Is it not very dark with no brightness in it? So God's going to judge the land. He's not judging the globe. Obadiah 1 and verse 15, for the day of the Lord is upon all nations is near. That's all nations that existed back then under that biblical world. This is not a global world that's being referenced here, Norm, in Obadiah. It is the biblical world that is being referenced. And the day of the Lord is a day of judgment on the nations, not the globe. Look at Zephaniah 1 and 7. For the day of the Lord is at hand. Same thing with Zephaniah. Look at verse 14. The great day of the Lord is near. Thus, the great day of the Lord is a day of judgment. It is a day of doom and darkness. And the great day of the Lord was never, listen to me, it was never a day in which God destroyed the globe. Never a day in which God appeared physically, visibly, and bodily. No, no, no. Nevertheless, the great day of the Lord manifested itself in and through the elements of judgment and wrath. So we have 2 Peter 3 and 10, in which the heavens will pass away. Well, Norm, did the Old Testament prophets use this term of the heavens passing away? And if they did, was it literal? It's either yes or no. I want to know from you. because Peter's using the same terms, the exact terms, and he's reminding them what the prophets said. So notice Isaiah 13, 9 and 10. Behold, the day of the Lord comes. Look at it. Look at this. For the stars of heaven and their constellations will not give their light, and the sun will be darkened in its going forth, and the moon will not cause its light to shine. So here is the heavens passing away, Norm. Now, was this literal? Yes or no? And if it was literal, then why are we still here? Look at Isaiah 34 and 1. Come near, you nations, to hear and heed, you people. Let the earth and all that is in it, the world and all things that come from it. This is the regional world and earth. For the indignation of the Lord is against all nations, and his fury against their armies. He has utterly destroyed them. He has given them over to the slaughter. Notice, also their slain shall be thrown out. Their stench shall rise from their corpses, and the mountains shall be melted with their blood. Is that hyperbolic language or literal language? You think blood can melt stone? Look at Isaiah 34 and 4. All the hosts of heaven shall be dissolved. Did you see that, Norm? It's dissolved. It was dissolved back then on Edom when God judged Edom. And the heavens shall be rolled up like a scroll. All their hosts shall fall down as a leaf falls from the vine, as a fruit falling from a fig tree. Now, Norm, was this literal? Yes or no? If it wasn't literal, then why, as Peter is reminding them about the voice of the prophets, the eschatology of the prophets, what the prophets said about the day of the Lord, why would it be literal in Peter's time? If it wasn't literal in the prophets' time, and Peter was reminding them exactly what the prophets said. Now, you answer that question. So if it was literal, then why are we still here? Because the heavens should have been dissolved back when God had his judgment fall on Edom. Look at verse 35. For my sword shall be bathed in heaven, and it shall come down on Edom and on the people of my curse for judgment. Look at verse 36. So the sword of the Lord is filled with blood. It's made overflowing with fatness, with the blood of lambs and goats, with the fat of the kidneys of rams. For the Lord has a sacrifice in Bozrah and a great slaughter in the land of Edom. For it is the day of the Lord's vengeance, the year of his recompense for the cause of Zion. So here again, we have the day of the Lord, the heavens passing away. Norm, this is simply Jewish judgment language, and it's the exact language that's used in the New Testament by the apostles. 2 Peter 3 and 10, the heavens will pass away. Now, we've dealt with that. That's not literal. That's a prophetical statement of the judgment of God. And it was always a regional passing away, not a global passing away. And you cannot prove otherwise, Norm Fields. And we're going to look at this term, a great noise, here. So, Norm, did the Old Testament prophets speak about a great noise when God judged the regional nations? Well, let's let the Old Testament prophets speak for themselves. Isaiah 29 and 6, you will be punished by the Lord of hosts with thunder and earthquake and a great noise, the storm and the tempest and the flame of devouring fire. Do you see that, how that's related? Zephaniah 1 and 14, the noise of the day of the Lord is bitter. So here's the judgment of God, and during the judgment of God, there is a great noise. It doesn't mean that the subatomic particles are disappearing. It just simply is referring to judgment. So the great noise is part of the punishment of the day of the Lord, but the punishment was never a destruction of the globe, Norm. So if the great noise indicated a literal destruction of the globe, then none of us would be here now because the globe would have been destroyed then. Now, why would this exact language mean something in the New Testament that it never meant in the Old Testament, especially when Peter says he's using the language of the Old Testament prophets to remind them of the eschatology that they had in the New Testament? So why is it that when folks read about this great noise of the day of the Lord in 2 Peter 3, they want to argue that it's in connection with the destruction of the globe and the universe, rather than simply a regional judgment of God upon the land or upon the people? So especially in the light of the fact that Peter told them that he was reminding them of what the Old Testament prophets said. 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 1 and 2. So 2 Peter 3 is not what Norm Fields said it is. It is not the destruction of subatomic particles. 2 Peter 3, 10 through 12, the elements will melt with fervent heat. So we're going to look at this, the elements melting. Did the Old Testament prophets use that term, Norm? Yes or no? So Peter says both the earth, it's the Greek word gay, which means the land, not the globe, and the works that are in it will be burned up. And thus the melting with fervent heat is qualified and modified by the words burned up. So the burning up is how the elements will melt. So notice 2 Peter 3:11, therefore, since all these things will be dissolved. So the melting and the dissolved are parallel. 2 Peter 3 and 12, the heavens will be dissolved, being on fire, and the earth will melt with fervent heat. We're going to see what the Old Testament prophets said about that. So is the heavens being dissolved and the earth melting, being on fire, a new concept? Norm, is this a New Testament concept only? Yes or no? Or has it been used before in the judgment of other nations? Well, look at Psalms 46 and 6. The nations raged, the kingdoms were moved. He uttered his voice and the earth melted. That was 1,000 years BC. So the earth melted then. Did it literally melt? Is that what God means when he says that the earth melts? That the earth is going to literally melt? Well, did it melt back then? Yes or no? I would say no. Look at Psalm 75, 2 and 3. When I choose the proper time, I will judge uprightly. The earth and all its inhabitants are dissolved. Well, was the earth and the inhabitants dissolved back then? Is this referring to the entire globe or just the region? Look at Amos 9 and 5. The Lord God of hosts, he who touches the earth and it melts. Now, Norm, surely you can see that this is the language, the judgment language of the Old Testament prophets. And this is the exact language that Peter was reminding them of. 2 Peter 3, 1 and 2. This isn't depicting the obliteration of the globe or the destruction of the periodic table of elements, but it's language depicting the judgment of God on a nation. So God is coming down for judgment. When he touches the earth in judgment, it melts. It melts away. It's dissolved. It's destroyed in his judgment. Look at Micah 1, verses 3 and 4. For behold, the Lord is coming out of his place. He will come down and tread on the high places of the earth. The mountains will melt under him, and the valleys will split like wax. Nahum 1 and 5. The mountains quake before him, the hills melt, and the earth heaves at his presence. Yes, the world and all who dwell in it, they also melt and they also heave, Norm, at God's presence. Nahum 2 and 6, the gates of the rivers are opened and the palace is dissolved. Nahum is dealing with God's judgment on Nineveh, and its palace being dissolved is equivalent to the city being judged. That's all that means. It's not literal. Zechariah 14 and 12, and this shall be the plague with which the Lord will strike all the people who fought against Jerusalem. Their flesh shall dissolve while they stand on their feet. Their eyes shall dissolve in their sockets, and their tongues shall dissolve in their mouths. Norm, is that literal? Yes or no? This is the judgment of AD 70, and God is going to remove any ability that they have to witness against his kingdom or his glory and his reign, and they're going to suffer defeat in being judged. And this is expressed in the word dissolve. That's all this means. And thus we find in 2 Peter 3, there's nothing more than Jewish judgment language. Is the fulfillment of Isaiah 65 and 66, which is about God destroying the old covenant Jewish world and bringing in the new covenant world of Messiah in which righteousness dwells. And Norm's false doctrine of a destruction of the periodic table of elements, the destruction of the subatomic particles, has been defeated.